Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest instalment in our lecture series to mark the Decade of Centenaries, brought to you by Louth County Library Service. I'm joined tonight by Dr. Peter Rigney. Peter has a lifetime of service to society behind him through his work with the trade union movement. He's also a historian, and his latest book is The Irish Munitions Embargo of 1920, How Railwaymen and Dockers Defied an Empire. Dr. Rigney also works as an assistant archivist with the Irish Railway Records Society and is co-editor of SAHER, the Irish Labour History Society's journal. So I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. So, Peter, off you go.
Okay, thank you. Just a brief background. The Great Northern Railway, Ireland, was founded in 1876 by the amalgamation of four existing companies. It ran in an area comprehended by Dublin, Navan, Bundoran, Derry, Antrim, Newcastle. The general manager was based in Dublin, the traffic manager was based in Belfast, and the workshop was based in Dundalk. In addition, and because they have a role to play in this, the trade unions which emerged from the 1890s on were based in Britain, and there were three of them. The National Union of Railwaymen, the Associated Society of Locomotive Engineers and Firemen, both of which were based in London and now no longer operate in Ireland, and the Railway Clerks Association, which is what it is, and is now the Transport Salary Staff Association. The Great Northern Railway was one of the 28 private operating companies in Ireland. Railways, in the discussion up to partition and Home Rule and things like that, it was assumed that railways would be a competency of the Council of Ireland, which is provided for in the third Home Rule Bill. And the fact that the Council of Ireland never functioned meant that tidying up the railway system in the period 2021 and 22 was not as simple as it might have been. Okay, from a Dundalk point of view, the services. In 1910, there were 7 departures from Dundalk northwards to Belfast between 7:17 in the morning and 11 minutes past 10 at night, and a similar service pattern southwards to Dublin. There were 4 trains westward from Dundalk to Enniskillen, and by its connection with the Dundalk, Newry and Greenoa Railway, those travelling from Belfast to London had the option, from London to Belfast had the following option. They could join the boat train at 9:15, get off the boat at Holyhead, get up at the unearthly hour of 5:37 in the morning, and get a train from Dunleary or Kingstown, as it was then, with 2 coaches to Dundalk, and you get into Belfast at 9:20. On the other hand, you could change to another steamer in Holyhead, get the boat to Greenoa, get the boat train from Greenoa to Belfast, and arrive there suitably rested at an hour earlier in the morning. So there was a different travel pattern. The big background to this, of course, is World War I, because no treatment of the Irish Revolution is complete without looking at World War I. And Ireland is, in a way, one of the states, like Poland or Lithuania or Czechoslovakia as it emerged, that emerged from the wreckage of empires of World War I. And always remember that in terms of its landmass, Great Britain lost more territory in this period than did Germany. The enlistment rate on the Great Northern was 12% of staff. That was compared to about 8% in the other Dublin-based companies. That includes people who joined up or people who were mobilised as reservists. But war brought increased traffic. So there were 655 staff of the GNR who served in the forces in World War I. However, between August 1914 and November 1918, the company recruited 114 engine cleaners. An engine cleaner is a fancy word for a locomotive driver apprentice. The other byproduct, and it's something I'll deal with, the war promoted motor transport. It moved motor transport out from being luxury toys into mass-produced vehicles used by a lot of people. And it trained thousands of men in the army to drive and to maintain these motor vehicles. Now, where are the records? Okay, the records I've used are in the Railway Record Society in Dublin. They are the files of the locomotive engineer, which was based in Dundalk, which cover not only the humdrum bits of engineering, but the industrial relations and social aspect of the works. There is the staff card index, a huge multi-drawer card index of all the staff who retired before 1958. In 1958, the GNR was split between CIE and the Ulster Transport Authority, and the current cards in 58 were taken, but anyone before that is in the card index that the Rail Record Society have. The company very kindly in World War I, anyone who enlisted in what was then called the European War got a crimson card, so it makes it easy to find out who served in World War I. The general manager's files are there, but they only exist from the 1930s. But also what you have is the indexes to correspondence. So a correspondence index ledger is sometimes almost as useful as the correspondence itself, because it will tell you what the what's in the files. So, for example, in 1922, we're looking at the Civil War, we're looking at derailments, and I'll come back to this. You find most of the derailments on the Great Northern Railway were not due to IRA activity or attacks, but it was due to a new brand of engine which they bought, which was too heavy for a lot of the track. Okay, what were the big issues for the company? Well, the big issue was union recognition. The unions in Great Britain had secured a form of recognition. The Irish companies were considerably less favourable. The companies were split. There were two of the companies in Dublin said, look, this is going to happen anyway. It's happening in Great Britain. We're going to be pushed into it by the government. We should engage with the unions first and try and deal with them before it's forced upon us. The Great Northern was very much against that view, and they if you like, worked with the largest company, the Great Southern and Western Railway, to make sure that that did not prevail. The general manager of the Great Northern Railway was a man called John Bagwell, who actually lived in Clonmel. He was a senator in the early days of the Free State. He was kidnapped by the IRA in 1922 or 23, and his house were burnt down. So, right, we go to 1916. It's an archivist's delight when somebody walks in off the street with a load of old papers. And about 15 years ago, a person walked in with a small file of papers she was the niece of a man called P.A. Foley, who retired as district superintendent of the GNR in Dublin. In 1916, P.A. Foley was a telegraphist clerk in Amiens Street Station when the military walked in. Now, obviously, the military needed to keep in contact with Belfast, and the GPO was unavailable to them for certain reasons. And what Foley did, he kept the copies of the telegrams he sent. And those telegrams, and they're a fairly small collection, but they tell you very interesting things, such as, for example, a telegram to the War Office in Dublin saying the rebels will not come out and fight. They are entrenched in various places. There's a telegram telling the people the traffic has been stopped. There are no trains to Hope, and the people must walk home. And also, in the middle of this chaos, some bright spark has sent a special train of mules towards Dublin, which has to be stopped and diverted back. However, the most important thing of that is the telegrams that were sent as to how the British Army in Dublin communicated with the British Army in Belfast. They got the telegraphist in Dublin to send a message to the station foreman in Great Victorian Street in Belfast saying, go to the garrison commander in Belfast, find out how things are there, and ask him, can he spare any trained men? Because we now know that Belfast was quiet in 1916. The instruction from the volunteers was not a shot in the north, but the British Army at the time had no way of knowing. The other thing that happened in 1916, which was far more important for the railway company, was that in December 1916, after years of agitating to get a cost of living bonus, as was paid in Great Britain, the unions reached the end of their tether. Now, they were afraid to declare an official strike because of the fear of being sued, but there was an unofficial strike threatened by locomotive drivers on the Great Southern and Western Railway. And the government took the railways under state control. The Irish government took the Irish railways under state control. This had been done in Britain in September 1914. And that meant that the unions got de facto recognition from the government, which they never got from the companies, and they managed to secure the implementation of British conditions in Ireland. So that when the 8-hour day came about in February of 1919, there's a typescript copy of it which was kept in the Union Handbook, and it showed the original agreement was the implementation date of the 1st of February 19 for the Railways of Great Britain, and added in handwriting is "and Ireland." So the most, the most dramatic event of the War of Independence, of course, and I'll deal with it earlier on and dispose of it, was the train ambush in Adavoyle in June 1921, when Frank Aiken's men derailed a troop train carrying the Hussars back from Belfast for the opening of the Northern Parliament. And that's a spectacular. A number of people were killed, including the guard on the train, a man called Gallagher from Belfast, who was guard on the train. And the press in England carried a fair amount of coverage of the derailment of the train, and emphasised particularly the amount of horses that were killed. Anyway, the other event of 1920 on the railways was what was called the munitions strike. Now, I'm now going to engage in shameless product placement, which is the book that I wrote, published by Irish Rail, called How Railway and Dockers Defied an Empire, the Irish Munitions Strike of 1920. It's available in all good booksellers, including Row River Books and Dundalk, or online at thebookshop.ie. So I'm not going to go into much detail on the munitions strike, because you can always buy the book. However, the strike happened in May. The National Union of Railwaymen had issued a directive to members in England not to handle munitions of war destined for Poland in the war against Russia. People were terrified that Winston Churchill, who had a reputation as a warmonger, would drag Britain into a war against the Soviet Union. And the NUR issued a union directive. Now, members in Ireland took the spirit of that directive and applied it to munitions of war. And beginning in May 1920, the railwaymen refused to handle armed troops or police and munitions of war. After a period of time, the normal sanction for this was dismissal. So the strike spread throughout the south and west and ran until December. It functioned quite differently in the northeast for a variety of reasons, which I'll go into. And it's assumed that it functioned differently in the northeast because Protestant Unionists would refuse to be part of it. But it's a bit more complex than that, because most Catholics in Ulster didn't support Sinn Féin. They supported the Irish Parliamentary Party and they supported Joe Devlin. So the munitions strike, therefore, was very, very patchy in its implementation on the Great Northern Railway and was enforced with a fair bit of intimidation. And at the early stages, the Train Drivers Union ASLEF in Dublin saw the potential of this to get very, very messy. And early on in the strike, the local branch officers met the locomotive engineer and asked, look, can we do a deal here? Can we ensure that munitions work is handed to the men from the Northern Division? What that meant was that, say, a troop train from Belfast would be handled exclusively by Belfast or Portadown men rather than by Dundalk or Dublin men. The company didn't accept that. They said, we're a common carrier company. We're not going to get involved in this, and you'll do your duty or face the consequences. So the incidence of intimidation of footplate staff on the GNR was far higher than in the south and west. I think from memory, and it's in the book, but I've forgotten the precise figures, there was about 43 incidents on the Great Northern Railway, whereas on the Great Southern and Western Railway, which is the biggest company, there was about 7. So what happened was, in August, the company, the 6 crews, the 6 locomotive crews who worked the branch into Bundorden, had either been kidnapped or had refused to work traffic and were sacked, and the Bundorden branch was closed. Now, this was not a plot by Sinn Féin to deprive Belfast people of their holidays, but Ballyshannon served Finner Camp, which was the largest military installation in the northwest. And in the end of September, early October, the Great Northern Railway closed the line from Dundalk to Enniskillen and the branches to Carrickmacross and Coote Hill. Now, there's a technology aspect to the munition strike. And one of the things that happened in Dundalk, I think about July or August 1920, is 2 lorries that had been stranded there. They were army lorries, and they were on wagons being transported back from Dublin to Carrickfergus, were burnt. A fairly insignificant incident in itself, but in 1920, if you had lorries and needed a repair, you didn't drive them or tow them back, you sent them by rail. And this shows you the importance of rail versus road in that period. The other thing happened that as the line from Dundalk to Enniskillen was closed, the Ulster Herald reported that traders are buying lorries. Because lorries were available now, they could be bought from the Army Surplus Board, and there were men to train them who had trained in the Army, because the trade of motor mechanic wasn't really established and didn't have the same restrictions that the craft unions would have imposed on it. So, if you like, while on one hand the munition strike had a political effect on the struggle for independence, it also had an economic and cultural effect in providing a laboratory for road transport. Now, obviously, the response of Unionists and Loyalists to this, sorry, I'll use the word Unionists because in 1920 speak, Loyalists means something different, because there were a substantial amount of Catholic Loyalists. They were people who believed in the Union, who had served in the RIC, served in the army. So we just use the term Unionist. You can see motions of NUR branches in Ballymena or in Banbridge, which would have been exclusively GNR, saying we fully support the line of the government and they should ensure that people railway and carry every traffic that's offered. On the other hand, you go to Derry and you see, say, the branch fully supports the attitude of members who refuse to carry traffic and lead to another Amritsar. Amritsar was a notorious massacre in the Sikh holy city in India in 1919, where British troops, under the command, I think, of an Irish general, fired on a crowd and killed several hundred people. And the GNR received a number of memos from one, the engineman of the Northern Division, and a second one, this is interesting, from the loyal engineman of Derry, not the loyal engineman of Londonderry, saying, you will not take back these people and we won't work with them. Now, in fact, there was a delegation from the Unionist engineman brought in, and the company said, look, the government run the railway system, they'll have the final say, and most of the munition strikers will be brought back. In July 1920, following a speech made by Edward Carson, there was an attack on Catholics throughout East Ulster. And that was called the Belfast Expulsions. Now, there's a lovely file in the Rail Record Society called Disturbances in Belfast, Requests for Police Protection. I won't go into the details of it here, but it includes 2 things. One, it includes an interview with the management and a delegation of the Loyalist workers. And the Loyalist workers are named and categorised by their union affiliation and also by their political attitude, which is defined as either moderate, extreme or irreconcilable. But the Unionist workers make the point is this is not anti-Catholic, because they said we have not gone near enginemen, our drivers and firemen who are Catholic and who are continuing to do their duty in defiance of the munition strike. One of the effects for Dundalk and the Great Northern Railway is that people could be shifted around. So the workshop concerned in Dundalk was the main wagon maintenance workshop in Adelaide, which is roughly where Windsor Park Football Stadium is now. So there were fitters from there sent to Dundalk. A number of semi-skilled men were sent to Armagh. But they were told that they could not stay in Dundalk because there was an understanding with the workforce in Dundalk that vacancies in Dundalk for trades were confined to people who had served their time there. The Belfast Expulsions spawned the Belfast boycott. And it's a classic example of that awful reaction in public administration of we have to be seen to do something. The Belfast boycott did not achieve the reinstatement of any Catholics, and there was a substantial amount of socialist and trade unionist Protestants who were thrown out as well. It didn't secure the reinstatement of one worker. It also secured the disemployment of a lot of Catholics who were employed in the distribution trades. So sorry, just hold a second. The Belfast boycott made the GNR particularly vulnerable because it was the main conduit of transport from of Ulster goods to the south. So a series of train raiding happened, and most of the train raids occurred between Newry and Dundalk, or between Monaghan and Richhill. And the Belfast boycott tailed off after the truce. There was no specific understanding that it would finish with the truce, but it began to ramp up again with the political uncertainty of 1922. In June 1922, Peter Murray, an electrician, was working in Newry, an employee of the GNR. He was staying in a converted coach, which is a mobile dormitory, and he was taken out by unknown men and shot. He was a Catholic and he was an ex-serviceman. The following day, shots were fired in to the houses, the railway houses in Domain Terrace. And following that, the company transferred a number of people out to Scarba, Belfast, Omagh, Enniskillen, and another one to Belfast. Now, you can argue as to what was the motivation for this. Was it sectarian? Was it political? Was it a bit of both? To a certain extent, it was sectarian. But if it was exclusively sectarian, there were other company houses in Brook Street and RD Terrace. However, those houses were occupied by shop trades, by fitters, by boiler makers, by coach painters. However, the Domain Terrace houses were occupied by traffic staff. So they were people who helped to keep the railway going during the munition strike. Now, the GNR, the munition strike finished in December 1920, with the promise from the British government of no victimisation. And the GNR refused to implement a no victimisation policy. And on the back of the book, you see the file, refusal to hand traffic men not to be taken back. And a blacklist was initially maintained. They included people who refused on the grounds of political principle or trade union principle, and they included people who had gone out on an unsuccessful strike in 1911 and who had signed an undertaking never to go on strike again. Now, that wasn't sorted out until June 1922. So I suspect that while part of the Domain Terrace shootings was sectarian, it was also tied in to the raggedy end of the munition strike on the Great Northern. There was also an aspect of what structure would the railway companies have in the Ireland that was emerging. It was originally envisaged the railways would be a competency of the Council of Ireland. The Council of Ireland was a cross-border structure conveyed in the Third Home Rule Bill. There was to be a railway commission because the economic position of the railways in Ireland changed radically due to two things. One, road transport, which I mentioned, and the other, the 8-hour day. The railways in the south, lying wholly within the south, went down the line which had been followed in England and grouped together to form the Great Southern Railways, which was formed in 1925. The Northern government had no fixed attitude on it because their largest system was the Great Northern, of whom 1/3 of its system lay in the south and its main workshops lay in the south. The second largest system was owned by the London Midland and Scottish Railway. So the Northern government really had no incentive to centralise. At one stage in 1922-23, there was an amalgamation proposal put up between the Great Northern Railway and the Midland Great Western Railway, which would have meant a line which would have covered Dublin to Clifton to Derry to Belfast to Newcastle. A huge system. However, that was shot down, not on ostensibly partitionist grounds, but because it was believed that that would have the effect of diverting traffic from Dublin Port to Belfast Port. As I say, there was financial problems, but, and interestingly enough, one of the things that I won't deal with it here, one of the things that emerged from this was the establishment of an Irish Railway Wages Board, which was an all-island body to deal with wages, which was set up mainly by the Northern government in 1923. And when you're making submissions to, if you're a player in industrial relations and you're making a submission to a third party, you tend to throw in the kitchen sink. Believe me, I've done it. But between 1923 and 1934, the railway companies in their pleading towards the Wages Board never mentioned partition, because partition did not really affect them greatly. What affected them greatly was the economic war in 1932. Okay, so the merger proposal of 1922-23 did not go, and the private railways in Northern Ireland stayed as they were, plus 4 railways which crossed the border. The Dundalk, Newry and Greenore, which was owned ultimately by British Railways, the Sligo, Leitrim and Northern Counties Railway, which ran from Enniskillen to Sligo, and the 2 Donegal lines, the County Donegal Railways Joint Committee and the Londonderry and Lough Railway. Okay, road transport. You can see this ramping up from 1919. So, for example, in Dundalk, you see Halpenny's bus service. Halpenny's bus service was founded by a man called Joe Halpenny, who came home from the British Army in the Middle East and had learned the trade of lorry mechanic and applied that to his bus business. Derry Corporation established a bus service as early as 1920 to replace their horse trams. Their horse trams had to be closed when the British Army requisitioned the horses in 1917. And as early as 1921, the Great Northern Railway traffic manager circulated a memo when he said 200 lorries are circulating, robbing us of 20,000 tonnes of freight per annum. And this is normally the higher value freight. He says within 40 miles of Dublin and 25 miles of Belfast, charabancs, which is an old-fashioned word for coaches, are operating scheduled services. So this operates, you have a technological change which is beginning to operate as early as 1920. Okay, the Civil War. The Civil War, the railways in the south and west were attacked by the anti-treaty forces for a number of reasons. One, they were carrying troops, and two, in the absence of, in order to demonstrate the non-legitimacy of the Free State government, the railways were a soft target, and they were a very public, demonstrable target. You get this today in northwest India, where the Maoist guerrillas called the Naxalites, if they want to make a point, they attack the railway system. And this is, again, the Great Northern Railway was relatively unaffected. So one of the things that a historian would do is go to the civil engineers' ledgers for correspondence files and look up derailment, because derailment was a common part of the Civil War. And if you look, the average between 1919 and 1924 were 160 derailments per annum. These are not major disasters. This is maybe a shunting engine in a goods store putting one set of wheels off the track. So that figure 160 goes to 190 in 1922, which at first looks a significant figure, except when you drill down into the extra 30. None of them were caused by anti-treaty IRA attacks on the railway. They were all caused by a new class of locomotive, the D-class locomotives, which were too heavy, and as a result, for a number of years, they were barred off certain sections of the line. This demonstrates the dangers of historians jumping to conclusions. During the Civil War, Louth accounted for 9.3% of the route mileage of the Great Northern Railway, but 67.5% of the incidents on the track. The general manager of the railway, Bagwell, was kidnapped. His house near Clonmel was burnt, and Bagwell was rescued by Commandant Dan Hogan of the Free State Army, who in previous years had been a lowly clerk on the Great Northern Railway, which showed how roles change in a relatively short time. There was also armoured trains deployed on the Great Northern Railway, and we find that not through any record or archive, but through the financial records, because armoured trains hired from another company, they get invoiced. Whether there's a war on or no war on, you issue invoices and you get your money in. And there's a record there of armoured trains hired in from the Great Southern and Western Railway. So there was another war going on, or a struggle going on. As I mentioned before, the British government conceded British conditions to Irish railmen in the period up to 1919. When the railways were handed back to their shareholders in 1922, the railway said, we are not going to, sorry, in 1921, we're not going to apply the conditions. And the Great Northern Railway tried to impose a 10-hour day and a 12-hour day, and there was a strike. And they caved in and took part in the arbitration process to which the other companies had signed up, which caused the Railway Gazette, which was mainly a pro-shareholder official journal in England, said they had brought this on themselves because they refused to engage in an arbitration process, and yet they caved in front of a strike, which means their net position is weaker. The Provisional Government in 1922 took a position, we have a civil war on, we're not going to countenance a railway strike. So what happened was, and it's not the time to go into it, I don't have the time to go into it, is again, one of the outcomes of the 22-23 period was the Irish Railway Wages Board. What happened to people who were imprisoned or took part in the Republican side? Well, firstly, the Great Northern Railway took a very hard line on certain things, but interestingly enough, they took a distinction between men interned and men imprisoned. They took the view somebody in prison has been convicted of a crime, somebody interned has not been convicted of a crime, so they were taken back. There's a case of Clark Keenan, who, if you look at his staff record, was dismissed in May 1916. He was involved in the 1916 rising, but was reinstated in February 1922. Now, Joe McGrath, who was Minister of Labour in the new state, negotiated a deal with the railway companies that all people who were dismissed for 1916 related matters, and there were a lot of them, were to be taken back. You will look in vain in any of the company board minute books that I have seen to see any mention of that. Possibly the reason being that companies decided not to record certain things in that period. All the more so that in July 1920, the chairman of the Dublin South Eastern Railway, Frank Brooke, one of the Brookes from Fermanagh, who had a very, very gung-ho pro-government attitude in that period, was sitting in his office midday on Saturday, and Jim Slattery and Paddy Daly from the squad came in and shot him. So a couple of things happened then. One, the IRA set up, the biggest company, the Great Southern and Western Railway, set up a secret line of communication with the IRA. And two, certain things that would have happened, that would have been recorded in normal times, didn't get recorded. And again, that shows the danger to the historian of relying exclusively on the written archive. Okay, conclusions. 1919 to 23 was a revolutionary period, but it was a revolutionary period in more than one way. The biggest revolution for the railway company was the revolution in the availability of cheap trucks and men to drive them. There were so many cheap trucks made available, sold by the Army Surplus Board, that the British Army Irish Command complained bitterly that all the decent trucks had been sold off and they were left with the rubbish. The second revolution was the forcing of a settlement and of collective bargaining on the railway companies. And the third revolution is, of course, the political revolution that we know about and that we learn about. But again, the institution of the border in 1923 was not a showstopper in terms of railway company finances. It was the economic war. Civil War damage got repaired. The wagons that were burnt were either scrapped or replaced. The Ballurgan viaduct on the Dundalk Uriam Green Ore was replaced. But partition had the effect of excluding the railways that crossed the border and the railways lying wholly in Northern Ireland from the grouping position we had in Ireland. So they survived unaltered until the late 1950s. The GNR, as a private company, was going to go bankrupt in 51-52 and was reconstituted as a cross-border semi-state body, and it survived until 1958. So that's roughly my time up, I think. Yep. And I'll happily take any questions you have. Cormac.
That's great. Excuse me. That's great, Peter. Thanks very much. I suppose the question I had was when they were talking about consolidation, did the companies were being consolidated after the First World War. Did the trade unions have anything to say about that at the time, or was there any threat to employment?
No, because part of the, well, again, this doesn't apply to the Great Northern Railway. As part of the 1924 Railways Act, the railways had to, if there were people declared surplus, the railways had to pay them compensation. So there was no particular. The union preference both in Ireland and in Great Britain was for nationalisation, but that didn't come about until a later generation.
Okay, Johnny Doyle wants to know, are the 1916 telegrams mentioned online anywhere?
They're not mentioned online, though. It's something that, that's something that the Rail Record Society would consider putting up, because it's a relatively small collection and would be quite easy to do.
Okay, interesting. And do you see many in the records? Do you see much complaint from the employees on the railways about the conditions when, in things like the Civil War, where there are, even if the derailments are, as you said, quite minor, rather than flying off the track, there's just two wheels off a track, and so on. Is there much complaint, or is there much dissatisfaction? Are they afraid? Are they happy? Are they phlegmatic, ultimately philosophical about what's going on to be just the workers in general?
A substantial amount of railwaymen were laid off due to disruption in traffic. And in August, September 1922, the Free State government, who didn't trust the railways because they regarded them as a bastion of the old establishment, they actually approached the unions and said, we will enlist your men into the army to run a thing called the Railway Protection and Maintenance Corps. We will pay them a civilian national insurance stamp, and although they will be subject to army discipline, they will have access to trade union officials, which is a pretty weird setup, but that's what they wanted and that's what they got. So an awful lot of railwaymen voted with their feet and enlisted in the National Army. Now, that being said, there were some railwaymen who took the anti-treaty side as well. But it was quite dangerous, and there were a number of railwaymen in the south and west who were killed in the 22-23 period. Incidentally, on the 6th of September last, there was a plaque unveiled in Mallow Station to railwaymen who were killed in the line of duty in 1920 in the truce. They include men who were killed by the IRA, of whom there were 3. The last of whom was a man called Draper Holmes, who was a Protestant permanent way worker, who was shot a few days before the truce, somewhere around between Mike and Adavoyle. Now, if you read the military service pension scheme, that, to all intents and purposes, was a sectarian assassination. I mean, the fellow who shot him said he wasn't one of us, and therefore we knew he was their enemy. Bang. Of the dozen or so who were killed, 3 were killed by the IRA, 2 were killed in crossfire in a train ambush, and the rest were killed mainly by the RIC. But the philosophy behind that was to record people who were killed in the line of duty, because that's something that I saw as something that was lacking.
That's great, thanks. Now, you mentioned people being reinstated there, and how it's not mentioned in the records that it's because of 1916. I wonder, have you found much of that in the pensions records? Since you just mentioned the pensions records as well. That's something you would see, wouldn't you? Because they would. If you're claiming compensation, one of the things you'll be claiming for is, okay, I was sacked in 1916 and I didn't get my job back for 6 years. So obviously that's a way of tracing. I wonder how much do you see of that?
You see a fair bit, and you see the main group of people sacked were on the Great Southern and Western Railway from the works, and they all say, I was out for a couple of years, but Joe McGrath did a deal and got us back in 1922. But you'll search. I mean, this is the strange thing about company records in these times. A minister of a government, and albeit a fairly new government, meets a company and does a deal, and it doesn't go to board. Or it doesn't, the board, and the board micromanages. Like, the chief mechanical engineer of the Great Southern Western Railway wanted authority to buy a new horse. He had to go to the board. So boards were, extremely micromanagerial types, and yet a minister can be met and a deal can be done and it doesn't get mentioned.
Yeah, it's interesting. Johnny Doyle wants to know, were there many armoured trains in use during the Civil War?
There were, yeah. There was an armoured train built in Dundalk. But before that, there was an armoured train from the Great Southern and Western Railway was used on the Great Northern. We know that because there was an invoice issued from the Great Southern and Western Railway to the GNR for wages at such and such for a driver and fireman. So armoured trains were used, and also Lancia armoured cars fitted on rails. You see, in terms of if you're on a train, as you probably know, you're high up, right? You're 10 or 50, you're about 10 foot off the ground, so you can command the surrounding countryside. Particularly with the heavy machine gun. So if you have an armoured train going out patrolling the line, you have a certain strategic advantage.
Okay, thanks. Another kind of maybe conflict-related question. You mentioned, victimization, no victimization, the blacklist dating back to the 1911 strike. I'm just wondering, and also you mentioned an incident where there was an outworking of the munitions strike in a shooting. How common was that, do you think, in terms of settling accounts later? Were there many more instances of intimidation or outright targeting of railway workers not just during the strike, say in the years after the strike? I mean, one thing as well about the strike could maybe be IRA intimidation during the strike, because I know there are some files I've seen where they're told not to intimidate people. So it just interesting.
That's what I would call the IRA Act. GHQ said the intimidation of railwaymen has to be cleared by GHQ, even when it's demanded by the local unions. But interestingly enough, I spoke to many years ago. I spoke to an old retired engine driver from Oma, and the most prominent case was a Belfast unionist called Bob Bruce, who was tarred and feathered and tied to a lamppost in Amiens Street in Dublin. Now, the press said he was taking some time off to go on a message down Talbot Street. In fact, he was going to the pub. And I asked this guy, after you've tarred and feathered, did he go back? Did he stop going to Dublin? He said, no, but he stopped going to the pub. But also then in 1921, after the GNR strike, the GNR was particularly militant in trying to fight against the 8-hour day, and there was the basis of a deal done for full reinstatement. The head guy, who was the locomotive engineer, Glover, who was in fact a Tynesider, said, "Yeah, okay, I'll reinstate these guys, but I have petitions wanting all these guys sacked, so I want a letter from every union branch saying you're okay with reinstatement." And he got that. And you can see letters from the Portadown, the Belfast, the Derry, etc. branches of ASLEF, the train drivers union, saying we have no objection to reinstatement and we have no objection to sorting out their pension and seniority. So in many ways, in terms of unionist sensibilities, the difference between 20 and 21 is, one, Ulster has been excluded, right? And two, people saw, well, the biggest enemy now is not Sinn Féin in the south. The biggest enemy to our wages and conditions is the company having a go at us. So these people don't present a threat.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thanks. I mean, I'm sure there are many people watching in to the Louth Decade of Centenaries program who are very familiar with getting off the train in Connolly and heading to the pub in Talbot Street.
Yes, but railway staff are strictly discouraged from doing so.
Yeah.
It is.
Thanks. I mean, just on that, what do your own sense from the records of the effect of the influence of the Great Northern Railway on, say, Louth in particular, or Louth in general and Dundalk in particular, in terms of just as not so much a company town, but the company in the town?
If you go further, it was very much part of the corporate establishment in Dundalk. So, for example, if you look in the 40s, there's a lot of correspondence with PJ Carroll's, another big employer, about the provision of bus services to get their workforce to work. During the war, more correctly, the emergency, the Great Northern Railway said, we have the General Secretary of the Railway Clerks Association coming over to do business with us, and tobacco is fairly strictly rationed, and we know he's a strong pipe smoker. Is there any chance you could fix us up with a consignment of pipe tobacco to give him? Which probably should have the union official concerned up before the ethics committee. But anyway, you get an awful lot of stuff about the life of Dundalk in the general manager's files from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. You also get some fascinating stuff and again, this is mission creep. You get the secretary of the ladies section of the Greenore Golf Club saying to the GNR, because at that stage the GNR operated the Dundalk, Newry and Greenore, and say, you operate a rail bus on the sort of 11 o'clock train to Greenore, but you're not put on a steam train because the rail bus is full, and Wednesday is the only day we are allowed to play golf by the men. And you see a copy of our membership card. So you get gender and class. Well, sorry, you also get class. There's a very boring file, well, boring to some people, about schedules between Belfast and Dublin. And this is said about the 1 o'clock Saturday train. There are problems in the dining car caused by the lower class women from an industrial background who proceed to the dining car straight away. But their money is as good as anyone else's, but they cause considerable offence to the first class passengers. And I presume this is, girls making plenty of money making parachutes and having hitting the 1940s equivalent of alcohol pops while the train is hardly past Windsor Park. So you get wonderful insights. Unfortunately, it's not there for the 20s, or you have to dig further for the 20s. There's a lovely one where in 1914 or 15, the chief mechanical engineer in Dundalk says, one of my best clerks is enlisted in the army. I want another clerk. And human resources in Dublin, they weren't called human resources, but that's what they were, said that. We've a couple of excellent lady typists that you could involve, and he would, no, I couldn't possibly take one of them. We don't have the toilets for them. So, it is a mirror of society as a whole.
Okay, thanks. Somebody wants, there's a question in here from Pat McDade. Do the GNR diversify into road freight at all?
Yeah, the GNR was empowered under, I think, an act of the 1930s to operate buses and lorries. And in fact, there's a book on the GNR road passenger services is available. I think there's a few copies in Row River Books in Dundalk. Now, that was taken off them in the north by a thing called the Northern Ireland Road Transport Board. But the GNR operated road freight services and road passenger service right until the end of the line in 1958.
That's great. Thanks, Peter. We've a question in from someone wanting to know, do you know anything about they're able to access the NUR ASRS records via Find My Past? And do you know anything about the ASLEF TSSA records?
I don't know anything about for the Find My Past, the ASLEF records. I don't know about. They're in the Modern Records Centre in Coventry. The ASRS NUR records have been put up on Find My Past. I did an undergraduate thesis on railway trade unionism more years ago than I care to remember, and there was no union records because the NUR pulled out of this country in 1952, and ASLEF left in 1969, and there are very, very few records left in Ireland.
Okay. I think some people watching in anyway would be familiar with the GNR's role in Dundalk Football Club. I think they're wearing a jersey this year to commemorate it. If not this year, it was last year. I'm just wondering, do you know anything more about that in terms of the club joining the Leinster Senior League, followed by the League of Ireland, having obviously been just a team playing in the local league in Dundalk prior to that?
I don't. All I know is that the Dundalk FC grew out of the works, as many St Patrick's Athletic grew out of Inchicore works. It's sport follows industrial employment.
I mean, it's interesting. I think if you look at even now some of the main, if you look at where the kids playing for the underage international teams or the League of Ireland clubs themselves, very frequently attracts railway employment in the country. And I think Dundalk as well used to have the artillery regiment in the barracks. So I think that would be another flag for football. To get us back on track to the more conventional decade of centenaries type lecture, do you have any sense about where I know the munitions workers, as Charles Townsend has said, he thinks that the munitions strike was a very good example of or he found it strange that it wasn't brought up more often in the nationalist historiography, because it was something that was a good example maybe to use if you were arguing that the IRA and Sinn Féin had a broad support among the Irish people at the time. So I was just wondering, do you want to speak to that, like the levels of support for the War of Independence and what they were prepared, what railwaymen in particular were prepared to support at the time?
Well, actually, and again, this is not product placement, I promise. But if you look at the title of my pamphlet, How Railwaymen and Dockers Defied an Empire, that was taken from the Irish Independent of 1967 and was written a 2-day serial by a guy called Martin O'Sullivan, who was a retired locomotive driver and ASLEF union activist in Athlone. And he republished that later. And he says, I have written to the heads of history departments and I have asked why this was not covered. And it wasn't covered. And if you look at Ernie O'Malley's book On Another Man's Wound, he actually mentions about the unions gave us help, but we didn't respond to it. And there are a number of reasons for it. One, because railwaymen, they got financial compensation in a way, because in the 1944 Transport Act, which set up CIE, pensionable service lost due to imprisonment or patriotic service during the War of Independence was deemed to be pensionable. So if somebody was sacked for 6 months, they got back that pensionable service. Secondly, the history of the war tended to be written by the soldiers, and the civil history tended not to be written. And that's no fault of the soldiers; like, they were the people who put pen to paper. But it seems strange to me that the historical profession had to wait for Charles Townshend to come in from Britain before this was written up. You can see it also in Dorothy McArdle's otherwise excellent book on the Irish Republic. There's about a paragraph. But again, like, I grew up in Inchicore in the 70s, or at least I was in college in the 70s. And most of the, there was a few munition strike veterans still alive, and I talked briefly to them. But there was a lot of guys there who were locomotive drivers, and their fathers were sacked during the munition strike. And it was so commonplace that it wasn't really remarked upon. And I remember talking to the former ASLEF branch secretary in Athlone, who wrote a bit for the Rail Record Society Journal, and he says, it's my enduring regret I never talked to my father about his time during the munition strike. So yeah, it is a gap, and that was why when Irish Rail, to their credit, decided to do something for the decade of centenaries, myself and themselves got together to produce the munition strike pamphlet, which was produced incidentally during COVID, and only possible because I have the keys to the Railway Record Society archive, and a letter from the company secretary authorising me to exceed my 2-kilometre visit to visit the archive. So I mean, there are things that there were in writing that history. It is incomplete, as all history is incomplete, because I couldn't get to Kew in London, I couldn't get to the National Archives, and I couldn't get to the corporate records in the strong room in Houston, where you would have the board minutes of the Great Northern Railway. But historians do what they can with the records available.
That's great. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic. We had a question here: if the railway strikes paralysed the British war machine to such an extent, why did the IRA not concentrate their efforts on the railway stations, intimidate workers in general? Do they need more men to do it?
Because you don't. I mean, the munition strike didn't need any intimidation. The munition strike was a voluntary effort. And if you look, I mean, in the Civil War, the anti-treaty IRA tried to intimidate railwaymen, and said you will be a legitimate target as early as the 3rd of August 1922. And the result of which, I mean, you know Irish people, and when we're told to do something, I mean, people said, look, we did this voluntarily a year ago, and now they're telling us, and most railwaymen continue to work, although a small handful did support the anti-treaty IRA.
Yeah. I think as well, by the time the strike unravels in December 1920, they've reached the edge of what they can achieve in terms of disruption, and also escalation, because the next point is once the British have the so-called Black Week, which involved Kilmichael and Bloody Sunday, I think what the British were prepared to do to get the railways moving again would probably have got very messy if they tried to hold out with the strike any longer.
And indeed, and I mean, what if is a useful parlour game. But what people forget is two things. Firstly, the 2 days before the Railwaymen's Conference to call off the strike, there was an engine driver called Lawler in Dungarvan coming back in off a shift. He was driving to go to Cork, in Lismore. And he was shot by an army sentry. Now, it's a windy night, it's a winter's night, and the one thing you get if the footplate of a steam locomotive is incredibly noisy. And if you get down off it, I mean, I've always found your hearing doesn't, there's ringing in your ears from the noise. He failed to respond to a challenge and was shot. But the guy who proposed the motion, a guy called Jack Kenny from Inchicore, the guy who proposed the motion to resume work, now he was a strong NUR activist, would have worked with that man. Secondly, most of Munster was going under martial law. So we now know, with the benefit of history, that railwaymen weren't brought before drumhead court martials and shot. But there's no way of knowing that people at the time didn't know. And the other thing to do is to look at the other parallels from history. So, for example, in, I think, May 1944, the Dutch government in exile called upon the Dutch railwaymen to strike against the German occupation. And initially, the Germans were like headless chickens, a bit like the Brits were in May, June 21. But then Seyss-Inquart, the Gauleiter of Holland, said, if the railwaymen don't go back to work, the Dutch people will starve. And that's what happened. And 1944-45 is known in Holland as the Hunger Winter. If you go to France in 51-52, there was a strike by dockers and railwaymen against the exportation of arms to Indochina. And that was dealt with by strikers being fired upon by French military. And according to the prefect of Marseille, the CGT, which is then the biggest union in France, was, to quote him, decapitated in Marseille docks. So, rather than saying what might have happened, it's a more valid thing to say what happened in other countries to similar endeavours.
Okay, yeah, thanks. The one thing I think as well, the munitions strike maybe gave the War of Independence and the Irish Republic, as it would have been referred to at the time, I think it gave it a certain. I know it grew out, and you might explain to people watching and how it grew. I think you briefly touched on it, how it grew out of similar strikes in relation to the British attacking Soviet Russia. But I think the strike itself maybe gave the Irish War of Independence a certain amount of legitimacy, or further legitimacy within the British Labour movement, which then was, of course, a great acted as something of a restraint on British behaviour in Ireland at the time.
Yeah, well, there's two key figures in this. Well, sorry. Firstly, I mean, the official narrative from Britain is this is a murder gang. This is a small group of criminals running guns. So this is obviously not the case. From the trade union side, you have two people who are of interest. One is J.H. Thomas, General Secretary of the NUR, a Privy Councillor, MP for Derby, a man whose politics could basically describe as Empire Labour, a man who was described by one of his enemies as a man who, if he could, would go around wearing a Union Jack waistcoat. Now, J.H. Thomas came up with was pushing the idea of a Dominion settlement in mid-1920. The other guy is less well known, is Jack Bromley, General Secretary of the Local Drivers Union. And the British Labour Party set up a commission in Ireland, which went to Ireland during the Black Week in the winter of 1920. And Bromley writes in the Locomotive Journal, he said, when in Cork, he says, I saw what I thought I would never see. And he's describing an auxiliary. He says, a man dressed in the king's uniform, carrying a gun, obviously the worse for drink. So, I mean, this is what's feeding into the British Labour movement. The British Labour movement, the British Labour Party at this stage is, trying to present itself as being preparing for power. So they are not Irish Republicans or anywhere near it, but they're saying to the British, look, this is damning our reputation throughout the world and in the United States in particular, and we have got to do something about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the end of our questions. I think So there's not much more for me to do except to remind everybody that we're going to be having another talk from yourself in about 2 weeks' time on partition and trade unionism of the time. I think part of the point you're making is partition didn't really disrupt trade unionism. So we'll hear more from you about that. I think I should also mention, since you were engaged in product placement, that you contributed to this volume here, which is available in both, I'd say, all good bookshops and in the Louth County Library Service. And I think we'll also be having a chat next week on women's activism and the Irish Revolution next Tuesday. So to remind people to check online for that, as well as the symposium to which Peter is contributing, which is the Border 100 Symposium, which you will find out about in the local press and online. And I just remind Peter as well, just to check his email before we go. And have you any final word for us, Peter?
No, thank you very much. It's one of the nicer aspects of what has been a horrible 18 months is that, people can see more on Zoom, and people who, would think 2 or 3 times before going out on a wet, cold October night can now sit back through Zoom technology. It's made it's disseminated knowledge more widely, and it's probably, a good outcome. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your contribution, and here on getting people more involved and disseminating knowledge. So thanks, everybody, and we will see you next week for the next round of the Louth Decade of Centenaries program, and subsequent to that, the Border 100 Symposium. So thank you, everybody.